On this week's blog, we talked about what if I don't get to. I know it kind of seemed like probably an odd statement, but there's a lot of times in life where we feel like God puts something on our heart, or we have a desire to see something accomplished. And it's not that it's a bad thing, we just want to see this thing come to task. So we talk to maybe some of our friends, we ask others, we say, what do you think about this? And in gesture, it's a great thing. It is something that may even help others. And then we're like, oh yes, that sounds great. But in it, did we take the time to ask God if that's what He wanted us to do? I posted on there about at Wellness Witness, Cara asking the question, she had a long blog and it was beautiful, but the main point of it kind of was, if the very thing you've been praying fervently over, God accomplished through somebody else, how would you feel? How would you handle that? And of course, the real spiritual answer and the great answer is to say that I would cheer them on, that I would be so excited because as long as it was fulfilled, that's all that matters. But in our human fleshly nature, we need to realize that while that is how we want to feel, sometimes our actual feelings are a little bit different. As we used to say as kids, we might want to just take our ball and go home. We might think, oh, well, that was great. So God, you just accomplished that through her, and I'll just sit right over here and I'll be used for nothing, and I'll just sit on my little church pew and amen, and that'll be the end of it. But that's not what God's calling us to. Have you ever thought that maybe God put it on your heart also so that your prayers could be answered through them? That by your prayers, that person was strengthened and encouraged and directed? Did you ever pause to think that God puts those things on our hearts so we can be the prayer warriors that are fighting in the realm of the principalities to help accomplish His goal? Well, in the Bible, it has a story about King David, and we all know that King David was a man after God's own heart, but he also was a man, and he had flaws along the way. And he had fought many battles, and he was a valiant warrior. And one day when peace had finally come, and he's sitting back and he looks at this grand house that God's allowed him to build, and he stops and he looks over at the Ark of the Covenant, and he sees it still dwells in a tent. And he says, I live in this fine house, and yet the Ark resides in a tent. I would love to build God a house. He deserves something more magnificent than what I'm living in. And at the time, he's sharing it with Nathan the prophet, and he's telling him this, and he goes, absolutely. He's telling him, my layman terms, not biblical exact here, but he's like, that sounds great. Yes, go do everything that's in your heart. And it actually is in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And if you look at verse 2, it says that the king said unto Nathan the prophet, see now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwelleth within curtains. And Nathan said to the king, go, do all that is in thine heart, for the Lord is with thee. It sounded like a wonderful plan to build something for God, to honor Him, to glorify Him. But that night, it says in verse 4, and it came to pass that night that the word of the Lord came unto Nathan, saying, go and tell my servant David, thus saith the Lord, shalt thou build me an house for me to dwell in? Verse 6, whereas I have not dwelt in any house since the time that I brought up the children of Israel out of Egypt, even to this day, but have walked in a tent and in a tabernacle. Now it goes on to say that David was a mighty warrior, and that he would not be allowed to build the house, but that God would allow his son to build the house. Now I'm sure it was hard for Nathan to go back to David and say, check all that I told you last night. God said, yeah, you're not the man. You're not the man that's going to get to build the house. Good thought, but you don't qualify. I think sometimes that's how we feel when those things happen to us. But I love David's heart. I love his expression in this, because instead of just saying, oh, well, I guess God will have to put it all on my son's heart and he'll need to figure that out, he said, well, you know what? I can't build the house, but I can do everything in my power to make sure that they have everything they need to make it the most magnificent house ever built. So he starts writing out all these plans, and he starts gathering all these supplies, because David the king has made friends and has all this power and authority from all these places to gather the things that when his son took over reign, he would be ready to build the house. Sometimes our job is to build the house, but sometimes our job is to stand behind someone else, to stand in the gap, to pray, to fight, to encourage, to strengthen, and maybe even to do all the hard labor. And what looks like our eyes, they get the victory from. But when it's all said and done, it's not our victory anyway. It should all be for God's glory. So is there something right now that's in your life that you don't get to? Is there something right now that you really felt like God was calling you to accomplish, but now that you're on this side of it, it seems like somebody else is always being used. It seems like someone else is always getting to do it, and you're just always laboring or praying for it? Maybe that's what God's called you to do. Maybe without your hard work, without your dedicated prayers and commitment, it wouldn't be getting accomplished. So rather than deciding, I don't get to, so we give up, we decide, I don't get to, but guess what? I sure can help everybody else along this line get to. I hope it's encouraged your heart. I hope you have a very blessed evening.